The village of Brackenmere-on-Wold had always seemed to exist in a state of gentle suspension, as though time itself had learned to behave politely within its borders. Nothing hurried there. Even change, when it came, arrived apologetically, knocking first and waiting to be invited in. The hedgerows were trimmed with care, the lanes curved lazily between cottages whose windows displayed the same lace curtains year after year, and the rhythm of daily life followed patterns so familiar they were rarely questioned. People woke, worked, took tea, and slept with the quiet confidence that tomorrow would look very much like today. That was why the Spring Ridding Society tea mattered so deeply to the villagers. It was not merely an event, but a reassurance, proof that traditions endured, that refinement, civility, and order still held sway. For one afternoon each May, Brackenmere gathered to remind itself that it was the sort of place where books were discussed, china was handled carefully, and nothing truly dreadful ever intruded. Ashcroft House stood slightly apart from the village green, dignified and self-contained behind its iron gates. Its windows reflected the pale sunlight, and its gravel drive had been freshly raked that morning by the gardener, who took pride in such details. Inside, the great library waited in orderly silence. Tall shelves rose to the ceiling, heavy with leather-bound volumes whose spines bore names both famous and forgotten. The air smelled faintly of Polish paper and something older, the scent of rooms that had listened to many conversations and remembered all of them. Miss Jane Marple arrived early, as she preferred. She took her usual chair near the French windows, the light falling kindly over her neat grey hair and the small basket of knitting she carried everywhere. She greeted the maid with gentle warmth, settled herself, and began her stitches with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned long ago that observation was easiest when one appeared entirely occupied with something else. As the minutes passed, the library gradually filled. Mrs. Cartwright swept in first, already flushed, her expression brimming with anticipation that had little to do with literature. She spoke at once, commenting on the weather, the roses, and a vague remark about such odd things happening lately, though no one quite knew what she meant. The Reverend Lionel Brooks followed, murmuring polite greetings and glancing nervously at the bookshelves as though uncertain whether he approved of them all. Clara Hewitt arrived soon after, young and earnest, her gloved hands clasped tightly, her posture stiff with the effort of appearing confident among people who had known her since childhood. Geraldine Fenton entered last exactly at 3 o'clock, as she always did. She carried herself with brisk authority, the kind cultivated over years of being obeyed without needing to raise one's voice. Her morning black had softened into tasteful grays, and her sharp eyes took swift inventory of the room. She welcomed her guests, directed the placement of teacups, and reminded everyone of their readings with a tone that suggested forgetfulness would not be tolerated. Miss Marple noticed, however, a momentary hesitation when Geraldine's gaze fell upon Edward Mallory. It was brief, no more than a heartbeat, but it was there. Mallory stood near the fireplace, hands loosely clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He was a man who carried the past with him whether he wished to or not. Years earlier, he had been connected to Geraldine's niece, a subject that lingered in Brackenmere like an unspoken rule, acknowledged through silence rather than speech. Tea was served. Cups clinked softly. Biscuits were passed with murmured thanks. Conversation drifted gently, safe and unchallenging. Outside, birdsong floated through the open windows, mingling with the ticking of the mantel clock. When the readings began, the atmosphere grew pleasantly subdued. Voices rose and fell over familiar passages. The words themselves mattered less than the ritual of reading them. Miss Marple listened with mild interest, though her attention wandered more often to the speakers than to the poetry. People, she had long believed, revealed themselves far more clearly than books ever could. It was during Reverend Brooks's careful recitation that the disturbance occurred. A sound, soft but distinct, came from the far end of the library, behind the tall history shelves. It was not loud enough to alarm at once, yet wrong enough to unsettle. A scrape, perhaps, as though furniture had been nudged where it ought not to have been. Geraldine Fenton frowned sharply. She disliked disorder. "Is someone back there?" she called. No one answered. A pause followed, stretching just long enough to be uncomfortable. Edward Mallory moved without speaking, stepping around the shelves with quick, decisive strides. Those nearest saw his shoulders stiffen, then halt abruptly. For a moment he said nothing, and in that silence something cold settled over the room. When he spoke, his voice had lost all trace of courtesy. Someone fetched the police. They found Harold Pemberton lying on the rug between the shelves, his thin frame twisted slightly to one side. His spectacles lay several inches from his hand, one lens cracked cleanly through. His face, usually drawn tight with judgment and disapproval, looked oddly open now, surprised, almost innocent. There was no blood, no sign of violence, no visible wound at all, only the unmistakable stillness that left no room for doubt. A gasp escaped someone near the door. Clara Hewitt pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath coming fast and shallow. Mrs. Cartwright let out a thin, trembling sound that hovered uncertainly between horror and fascination. Geraldine Fenton stood rigid, one gloved hand braced against a chair, as though the room itself had shifted beneath her. Miss Marple did not rise. She looked instead at the living, at the quick glances exchanged, then quickly averted. At the subtle rearrangement of expressions as shock gave way to calculation, at the way Edward Mallory's eyes remained fixed on the body, not with grief but with something closer to disbelief. And then she noticed the teacup. It sat on a small side table behind the shelves, placed neatly, almost carefully. Steam still curled faintly from its surface. Someone had been there recently, very recently. Close enough to Harold Pemberton for conversation, perhaps even intimacy. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a second. She had seen that same look before, many years ago, in another village, under entirely different circumstances, the look of a moment that had not gone as planned, the stillness that followed a sudden decision. Her needles resumed their quiet rhythm. In places like Brackenmere, people believed danger arrived gladly, with shouting, with drama, with unmistakable signs. They rarely considered how often it came quietly instead, wrapped in politeness and familiarity, wearing the face of someone they greeted every day. As voices rose in confusion and someone rushed to summon help, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression gentle, her eyes thoughtful. Human nature, she reflected, did not change nearly as much as people liked to believe, and someone in that peaceful library had just revealed exactly who they were. Not by what they had done, but by how they were now behaving. The news did not travel quickly through Brackenmere-on-Wold. It exploded. Within an hour of the police car arriving at Ashcroft House, every cottage window seemed to glow with speculation. Doors opened and closed with unusual frequency. Curtains twitched with renewed purpose. By evening, the village had settled into a state of collective agitation that felt almost unfamiliar, as though the ground itself had been disturbed. Harold Pemberton dead. The words sounded unreal even when spoken. Aloud, he had been unpleasant, certainly, pedantic, sharp-tongued, and deeply invested in correcting others, but he had also been dependable in his way. He attended council meetings, wrote letters to the parish newsletter, and reminded people of rules they preferred to forget. Men like Harold Pemberton were not supposed to die suddenly on library rugs. They were meant to fade quietly, after long years of irritating everyone equally. The police arrived with efficiency that felt almost intrusive. Inspector Dale, a practical man with little patience for village sensitivities, took statements in the drawing room while constables moved carefully through the library. The body was removed under a blanket, though not before half the village had managed to glimpse it at least once. The absence it left behind seemed larger than the man himself had ever been. People talked, constantly, compulsively, because silence had become intolerable. Mrs. Cartwright was the first to speak publicly, positioning herself near the post office, lowering her voice only slightly as she described how unnatural the whole thing had felt. She insisted that Harold must have been arguing with someone. She had sensed tension, she said. Always had. Her memory grew more detailed with each retelling. Others added their own impression. Someone recalled a raised voice earlier in the week. Someone else mentioned a disagreement over village funds. Another remembered seeing Harold walking briskly toward Ashcroft House that morning, his expression quite set. Facts, half-facts and assumptions blended seamlessly. Clara Hewitt avoided the green altogether. She claimed a headache and stayed home, though those who passed her cottage noted that her lights remained on long into the night. The school children whispered that she had once been reprimanded harshly by Harold for using school funds improperly. A story with no clear source, but plenty of enthusiasm. Edward Mallory became the subject of particular attention. He had been the one to discover the body. That alone in Brackenmere carried weight. Some remembered his past connection to Geraldine Fenton's niece, how abruptly it had ended, how the girl had left the village soon after. Harold Pemberton, it was recalled, had disapproved of the match. He had made that disapproval known loudly and often. People began to nod thoughtfully as though this explained far more than it actually did. When Inspector Dale interviewed Mallory, he did so with professional detachment. Mallory answered calmly, though his jaw tightened when pressed about his history with the victim. He denied any recent conflict. The inspector noted this carefully, already forming a theory that required no great imagination. Geraldine Fenton retreated into dignified shock. She spoke little, received visitors stiffly, and insisted upon order returning to her household. Yet those who knew her well observed something strained beneath her composure, not grief exactly, but alarm. Ashcroft House had always been her stronghold. Now it felt compromised. Miss Marple, meanwhile, resumed her routine. She walked to the shops, attended church, and accepted invitations for tea with gentle gratitude. No one suspected her of investigation. Indeed, many forgot her presence entirely, which suited her very well. She listened. At the butcher's, she heard two women debate whether poison might have been used, though neither could say why Harold would have trusted anyone enough to accept it. At the grocer's, someone insisted the cracked spectacles meant a struggle had occurred, despite the constable's assurance to the contrary. At church, prayers were offered with unusual fervor, accompanied by sidelong glances towards certain pews. Miss Marple noticed not only what people said, but how they said it, who repeated rumors eagerly, who resisted them too strongly, who spoke of Harold with relief rather than sorrow. She noticed, too, how often one detail was quietly avoided. The teacup. Several guests had remembered tea being served. None recalled seeing Harold drink it. When asked, most waved the question aside, saying it meant nothing at all. People were remarkably united in their certainty that it were insignificant. Such unanimity, Miss Marple thought, was rarely accidental. Inspector Dale began leaning heavily toward Edward Mallory. The motive appeared simple enough: old resentment, unresolved grievance, opportunity. Mallory's discovery of the body made him both witness and suspect, a combination police had learned to distrust. When this became known, reactions varied. Some villagers felt satisfaction. A culprit, even an alleged one, brought comfort. Disorder could be named, contained, corrected. Others felt uneasy, though they could not articulate why. It was not that they believed Mallory innocent, merely that the explanation felt too tidy. Miss Marple was invited, almost reluctantly, to share tea with Geraldine Fenton one afternoon. The library had been restored to order, though the rug had been replaced and the shelves rearranged slightly. The room felt altered nonetheless, as though it remembered what had happened and disapproved of being asked to forget. Geraldine spoke carefully, choosing each word as though it might later be examined. "I cannot imagine why Harold would have been back there alone," she said. "He had no reason to be." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "People often go where they believe something awaits them." Geraldine's hand paused on her teacup. "Do you think so?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Especially when they think they are expected." That evening, Miss Marple reflected on the village's behavior with quiet concern. Brackenmere wished desperately to return to normal. It wanted a culprit, a motive, a conclusion. What it did not want was complexity. Yet complexity lingered everywhere. in Clara Hewitt's avoidance of eye contact, in Mrs. Cartwright's eagerness to be helpful, in Geraldine Fenton's tightly held composure, in Edward Mallory's controlled stillness, which spoke not of guilt, but of calculation, not his own, but someone else's. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, followed patterns as predictable as stitches on a needle. Fear made people talk too much. Guilt made them talk too little, and the most dangerous individuals were often those who appeared merely cooperative. Somewhere within the flurry of speculation and whispered certainty, the truth remained quietly untouched. Waiting, and Miss Marple, knitting by her window as dusk settled over Brackenmere, was quite certain it would not reveal itself willingly. In the days that followed, the village attempted to resume its ordinary rhythms, though nothing moved quite as smoothly as before. People still rose early, still queued at the baker's, still paused to comment on the weather, yet beneath these familiar motions ran a current of unease. Conversations faltered more easily. Laughter arrived late, if at all. Even the bird-song seemed sharper in the mornings, as though nature itself were aware that something had shifted. Inspector Dale remained in Brackenmere longer than expected. He took rooms at the small inn near the Green and spent his days revisiting statements, retracing movements, and asking questions that made people uncomfortable precisely because they seemed so ordinary. Where had you been before tea? Whom had you spoken with? Did you notice anything unusual? Most answered eagerly. Some answered defensively. Miss Marple watched it all with mild interest, never offering information unless asked directly, and even then only what was strictly accurate and gently phrased. Her presence had begun to fade into the background once more, a comfortable, elderly constant whom everyone assumed incapable of relevance. That assumption pleased her greatly. The inspector focused first on the library itself. The shelves were examined, the rug inspected, the side table noted. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance beyond what might reasonably occur if a man collapsed suddenly. The doctor confirmed what many suspected. Harold Pemberton had died of poisoning, delivered quickly and efficiently. This revelation caused a quiet stir. Poison suggested intention. It also suggested intimacy. People began reconsidering their assumptions. Poison was not the weapon of sudden rage. It required preparation, planning, opportunity, and most importantly, trust. Harold had been careful by nature. He disliked surprises and rarely accepted hospitality from those he disapproved of. The list of people he trusted enough to drink tea near was not long. Miss Marple listened closely as these realizations rippled through the village, noting how often certain names were spoken and how carefully others were avoided. Inspector Dale interviewed Clara Hewitt again. She sat stiffly in the small parlor of the schoolhouse, hands folded tightly in her lap. She answered questions with precision that bordered on rehearsal. Yes, she had attended the reading society. Yes, she had been upset by Harold's criticisms in the past. No, she had not spoken with him that day beyond polite greeting. When asked whether she had seen him drink tea, she hesitated. Just briefly. "I don't think so," she said, "though I wasn't watching him closely." Afterward, she wept. Not loudly, but with restrained, exhausted sobs that left her eyes red and her voice thin. The inspector, uncomfortable, ended the interview quickly. He did not note her reaction beyond a brief mention of distress. Miss Marple, however, noticed something else entirely. Not the tears, those were common enough, but the relief that followed them. Edward Mallory was questioned again that afternoon. He appeared composed, almost detached, though a faint tension lingered beneath his calm. He admitted to long-standing disagreements with Harold, but denied any recent confrontation. He had not shared tea with him, had not spoken privately with him, had not been behind the shelves before discovering the body. The inspector pressed harder this time. Mallory's answers remained steady. Too steady, some might say, but Miss Marple thought differently. Guilt, in her experience, rarely produced such consistency. Fear, perhaps. Fear of being misunderstood, but not guilt. Geraldine Fenton received Inspector Dale in her sitting room, seated upright in her high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly. She spoke with dignity, answering every question directly. Harold had been a difficult man, she admitted, but a useful one. He handled correspondence for several village committees. He knew many things. "Did he ever threaten you?" the inspector asked. "Harold threatened everyone," she replied coolly, "usually with letters." That evening, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Cartwright, who was nearly vibrating with information. "I always said there was something peculiar about him," Mrs. Cartwright confided. "Always watching, always noting things down. You never knew what he might remember." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Memory can be a powerful thing." Mrs. Cartwright leaned closer. "And you know, dear, I do believe he'd been speaking to someone just before the reading society. I saw him near the side path earlier that day." "Did you see whom he was speaking to?" Miss Marple asked. "Well, no," Mrs. Cartwright admitted, "but I could tell it was important." Miss Marple smiled kindly. Importance, she reflected, was often assigned after the fact. Over the next day, Inspector Dale uncovered something more concrete. Among Harold S. papers was a partially written letter unsent and unsigned. It contained references to long-standing improprieties and matters that could no longer be ignored. No names were mentioned, but the tone was unmistakably accusatory. The village absorbed this news with fascination. Now the story had shape. Blackmail, perhaps. Exposure. Man silenced before he could speak. Speculation intensified. People re-examined their neighbors with new interest. Every minor disagreement took on fresh significance. Every past mistake grew darker in hindsight. Miss Marple considered the letter carefully when it was described to her. Harold Pemberton, she knew, did not write vaguely. He preferred precision. If he had intended to accuse, he would have named his subject. The absence of names suggested uncertainty or doubt. Perhaps he had gone to the library expecting clarification. Perhaps he had been summoned. The inspector continued building his case against Edward Mallory, citing motive and proximity. Yet even as the theory solidified, something about it rang hollow. Miss Marple sensed it in the way the village relaxed slightly whenever Mallory's name was mentioned. Relief was not the same as conviction. Late one afternoon, she returned to Ashcroft House at Geraldine's invitation. They sat in the restored library, sunlight filtering through the windows. The shelves seemed unchanged, yet the room felt oddly vigilant, as though it had learned to watch. "I cannot bear the idea that this will define Brackenmere," Geraldine said quietly. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It already has, my dear. The question is only how truthfully." Geraldine looked at her sharply, then away. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the side table, not the original one, but its replacement. A new teacup sat upon it untouched. She thought of the cup found warm beside Harold's body, of how carefully it had been placed, of how someone had wanted the moment to appear ordinary. The early stages of investigation, she knew, often relied on what was visible, what lay plainly before the eye. But human behavior left subtler traces, patterns of expectation, moments of anticipation, reactions that betrayed prior knowledge. Someone in Brackenmere had expected Harold Pemberton to drink that tea, and someone had been very certain that he would. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as evening settled in, marking time with patient inevitability. By the end of the week, certainty had begun to settle over Brackenmere-on-Wold like a heavy mist. It dulled questions, softened doubts, and made the edges of the story blur conveniently into place. Inspector Dale, weary of the village's endless speculation, found comfort in a conclusion that appeared solid enough to withstand scrutiny. Edward Mallory, in the inspector's view, fitted neatly where the facts refused to arrange themselves. He had history with the victim. He had been present at the scene. He had discovered the body, and though there was no direct evidence tying him to the poison, the absence of alternatives made him increasingly attractive as a solution. When the inspector questioned him for the third time, the tone had shifted perceptibly. This was no longer information gathering. It was confirmation seeking. Mallory sensed it at once. His answers remained calm, but a wariness had crept into his voice. He knew how such things worked. A theory, once formed, resisted all contradiction. Every gesture became suspicious, every word a potential misstep. "You understand," Inspector Dale said, folding his notebook, "that your connection to Mr. Pemberton makes this difficult." Mallory met his gaze evenly. "I understand that you believe it does." The remark did not endear him to the inspector. Afterward, word spread quickly, as it always did, that Mallory was in serious trouble. Mrs. Cartwright repeated it with solemn satisfaction. Others nodded gravely, relieved to have a name to attach to their fear. The village preferred its dangers visible and contained. Even Geraldine Fenton seemed to accept the idea with quiet resignation. "If it must be someone," she said to Miss Marple one afternoon, "then perhaps it is better it be someone already apart." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Do you think so, my dear?" Geraldine hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose I only mean that it would be easier." "Easier," Miss Marple repeated softly, as though tasting the word. The inspector announced that Mallory would be formally charged pending final confirmation from the laboratory. This news brought a subtle but unmistakable change to the village atmosphere. Conversations regained confidence. People spoke more freely again, as though the danger had been named and therefore tamed. Only a few seemed troubled. Clara Hewitt grew increasingly withdrawn. She avoided gatherings entirely now, sending apologies written in a neat but trembling hand. The school closed early twice that week, for reasons no one could quite explain. Miss Marple paid her a visit one afternoon, bringing a small jar of homemade jam as excuse. Clara welcomed her politely, though her eyes darted toward the window more than once. Her sitting room was spotless, too spotless, as though order were being used as a defense. "They think it's Mr. Mallory," Clara said suddenly, as though unable to keep the thought contained. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "so they do." Clara's fingers twisted together. "It doesn't feel right." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Feelings are often dismissed, my dear. Yet they are rarely meaningless." Clara looked at her with something like desperation, then seemed to think better of speaking. A moment later she changed the subject entirely, asking after the roses in Miss Marple's garden. Miss Marple left with more concern than she had arrived with. Meanwhile, Inspector Dale reviewed the evidence again, growing increasingly confident. The poison, he believed, had likely been administered in the tea. The teacup's warmth suggested proximity, and though others had been present, Mallory's discovery of the body made him the most plausible candidate for such closeness. What troubled Miss Marple was not what the inspector believed, but what he did not question. He did not ask why Harold Pemberton would accept tea from Mallory at all. The two men had been civil but never friendly. Harold trusted rules, not people. If he had been behind the shelves with someone, it would have been someone he expected to meet, someone who had summoned him, perhaps under the guise of official business. Miss Marple remembered the unsent letter. Harold had been preparing to confront someone, but he had not yet decided whom. That suggested uncertainty, not resolve, and uncertainty often led people to seek reassurance. On Sunday afternoon, the village gathered after church, clustering in familiar groups. The bells had barely finished ringing before whispers resumed. Miss Marple sat on a bench near the green, knitting quietly as she listened. "He was always sticking his nose in other people's affairs," one woman muttered. "Well, that's what happens when you do that," another replied. Miss Marple's needles paused. Punishment, she reflected, was often mistaken for justice. As the inspector prepared his final report, a small development threatened to disturb his certainty. The laboratory results confirmed the presence of poison, but not in the cup found beside the body. Traces were minimal there, consistent with a decoy or a later placement. The true dose, it seemed, had been consumed earlier. This complication annoyed Inspector Dale. It introduced ambiguity where he preferred clarity. He reasoned that Mallory could easily have administered poison beforehand, perhaps during tea service. Yet Miss Marple noted how quickly this possibility was accepted, despite its improbability. Tea had been poured publicly, cups distributed openly. Many hands had passed among the china. A poisoning conducted in full view would require recklessness bordering on foolishness. That evening Miss Marple visited Ashcroft House again. Geraldine received her stiffly, fatigue evident beneath her composure. "I wish this would all be over," she said. "So do many people," Miss Marple replied. "Though endings arrived too easily often hide beginnings we have not yet understood." Geraldine frowned slightly, then dismissed the remark. As dusk settled, Miss Marple wandered briefly through the library. Her gaze moved not to the shelves, nor the rug, but to the floor of the room itself. The paths people naturally took, the places where privacy might be assumed without being complete. Behind the history shelves, one stood partially concealed, yet not hidden, close enough for conversation, close enough for trust, and close enough for deception. The village, content with its chosen suspect, had begun to relax. Miss Marple, however, felt a tightening certainty grow within her. When guilt is convenient, she knew it is often incorrect, and when everyone agrees too readily, someone else is usually very grateful indeed. As the certainty surrounding Edward Mallory hardened, so too did the village's desire to stop looking any deeper. Brackenmere-on-Wold had always preferred tidy explanations, the sort that could be folded away and stored neatly with the rest of its memories. Once a person was identified as the cause of discomfort, everything else could return to order. Yet beneath that fragile calm, unease continued to stir. Inspector Dale pressed forward, but the process began to expose things he had not anticipated. Interviews conducted again, this time with sharper focus, revealed inconsistencies so small they might easily have been overlooked had they not begun to repeat themselves. Harold Pemberton, it emerged, had not simply been unpleasant. He had been busy. In the weeks before his death, he had asked questions. Not openly. Harold rarely confronted without preparation, but obliquely. He had requested old council minutes. He had inquired about financial records connected to village events. He had mentioned correcting an oversight to more than one person. No one had thought much of it at the time. Harold often busied himself with other people's affairs. But now those quiet inquiries took on a sharper edge. Mrs. Cartwright admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that Harold had visited her the previous week. He had asked about fundraising receipts from the summer fete. She had laughed it off, telling him she kept things well enough. His expression, she recalled after some thought, had been disapproving. Clara Hewitt, questioned yet again, admitted that Harold had approached her after school one afternoon. He had asked about an old grant used to repair the roof years earlier. She insisted she had nothing to hide, though her voice shook as she said it. Geraldine Fenton, too, was forced to acknowledge that Harold had requested access to certain correspondence stored at Ashcroft House. She had refused him, politely but firmly. He had not argued, only nodded in that disquieting way of his, as though making a note. Miss Marple absorbed these revelations quietly. Harold Pemberton, she thought, had not been preparing to accuse one person. He had been circling several. Secrets, once stirred, had a way of rising together. The inspector grew irritated by these developments. They complicated his narrative, pulling attention away from Mallory and toward the broader village. He dismissed most of the inquiries as irrelevant, the sort of bureaucratic fussing Harold had always enjoyed. Yet one thing unsettled him. No one could say precisely why Harold had gone to the library that afternoon. He had not been scheduled to read. He had not been expected early. And yet he had arrived before most of the guests and gone directly behind the shelves. Someone, Miss Marple was quite certain, had arranged that meeting. The problem was discovering who. She began paying closer attention to reactions rather than statements. When the inspector mentioned Harold S. inquiries, some villagers responded with irritation, others with embarrassment, and one or two with something far more dangerous. Relief. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Cartwright again near the post office. The woman spoke at length about how dreadful it all was, yet her tone held a peculiar lightness. "At least it's nearly settled," she said. "Once Mr. Mallory's dealt with, we can all move on." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Move on from what, exactly?" Mrs. Cartwright blinked. "Why, from all this unpleasantness." Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though unpleasantness rarely disappears simply because one stops speaking of it. Mrs. Cartwright laughed nervously and changed the subject. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Clara Hewitt once more. This time, the schoolteacher looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her composure frayed more easily. "I didn't want him to die," Clara said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple did not appear startled. No one imagines such things ending so decisively. Clara swallowed. "He said he was only asking questions, but he looked at me as though he already knew." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "People often mistake certainty for knowledge." Clara nodded miserably. "I thought if I could just explain." She broke off, pressing her lips together. Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the silence to settle. Silence, she knew, encouraged truths to stretch toward the surface, but Clara said no more. That evening, Inspector Dale received a small but troubling detail from the innkeeper. On the morning of the Reading Society, Harold Pemberton had been seen speaking with a woman near Ashcroft House. The innkeeper could not be sure who it was, only that the conversation appeared serious and that Harold had seemed unusually deferential. Deferential was not a word often associated with Harold Pemberton. The inspector questioned Geraldine Fenton again. She denied speaking privately with Harold that morning. Her denial was firm, too firm. Miss Marple later reflected. Though not necessarily dishonest, Miss Marple considered the matter carefully. If Harold believed he had uncovered wrongdoing, he would have approached the person he thought most capable of addressing it, or most threatened by it. Power in villages as in cities took many forms. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting untouched in her lap. She thought of the teacup again. Not its contents, but its placement. Careful, considerate, as though someone had wished to appear kind. Poisoning, she knew, was often chosen not for cruelty but for distance. It allowed one to avoid confrontation, to maintain a certain self-image even while committing murder. Someone had wanted Harold silenced, not in anger, but in fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequences. Fear of losing respect in a village where reputation functioned as currency. The inspector, still intent on his original suspect, failed to see the shift taking place beneath his feet. The case had begun as a matter of one man's grievance. It was becoming something else entirely. Miss Marple was quite certain now that the murderer was not the person everyone feared, but the one everyone trusted. And that realization, she reflected sadly, was almost always the most dangerous of all. As the investigation deepened, the mood in Brackenmere-on-Wold shifted once again, this time toward something quieter and more brittle. Certainty had cracked. In its place grew suspicion, not sharp and accusatory, but cautious, watchful. People measured their words more carefully now. Conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached. Doors closed sooner than usual. The village had begun to look inward. Inspector Dale felt it too, though he resisted acknowledging it. He sensed cooperation thinning, politeness turning guarded. The ease with which villagers had once volunteered opinions was gone. Now each question seemed to carry risk. What unsettled him most was that the facts no longer behaved. Harold Pemberton's movements on the day of his death had been reconstructed repeatedly, yet each version contained gaps that refused to align. He had arrived early. He had not spoken to most of the guests. And he had gone directly to the far end of the library. Not wandering, not searching, but with purpose. Purpose implied expectation. The inspector questioned the household staff at Ashcroft House once more. The maid recalled seeing Harold enter alone. She had assumed he was meeting Miss Fenton. When asked why, she hesitated. Because he said he had an appointment, she explained. With whom? The inspector asked. She shook her head. He didn't say, only that it was important. Miss Marple learned this detail later that afternoon, and it settled into place with quiet inevitability. An appointment suggested invitation. Someone had summoned Harold Pemberton. The difficulty lay in determining who would have dared. Geraldine Fenton, by virtue of her authority, could have done so easily. Yet her behavior since the murder spoke of fear, not guilt. She had retreated, not relaxed. People who succeed in eliminating a threat rarely display such tension afterward. Clara Hewitt, though frightened, lacked the confidence such a plan would require. Edward Mallory remained the most visible suspect, yet his apparent isolation after the death suggested not concealment, but bewilderment. He had gained nothing from Harold's silence. Miss Marple considered instead those who had gained the most peace. Mrs. Cartwright had become notably cheerful in recent days. She spoke often of the village returning to normal, of how dreadful it all had been, of how glad she was it was nearly over. Relief came easily to her. Too easily. Miss Marple paid her a visit one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing a cookbook. Mrs. Cartwright welcomed her effusively, ushering her into the sitting room with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness. Tea was produced at once, poured with practiced hospitality. "You must think us all quite dreadful," Mrs. Cartwright said lightly. "Such drama for a place like Brackenmere." "Drama often grows where it is least expected," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Cartwright laughed. "Well, thank goodness it's nearly done." Miss Marple accepted her tea but did not drink it at once. Instead, she glanced about the room, at the tidy shelves, the carefully stacked papers, the neat order that suggested a woman who valued control. "Harold Pemberton was fond of records," Miss Marple said mildly. "I imagine he appreciated organization." Mrs. Cartwright's smile faltered just for a moment. "Oh, he was always poking about," she said. "Nose in everyone's business." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That can be very uncomfortable." Mrs. Cartwright set her cup down a little too firmly. "He had no right," she said. "Some things are private." Miss Marple looked at her gently, even when public money is involved. The silence that followed was brief but telling. Mrs. Cartwright recovered quickly, laughing again. "You do have an imagination, Miss Marple." "An old one," Miss Marple replied serenely. Well exercised, she left soon afterward. Her suspicions deepened. That evening, Inspector Dale received confirmation that several village accounts contained irregularities, small amounts missing, adjusted, explained away. Nothing dramatic enough to provoke investigation before, but enough to provoke questions if someone persistent were looking. Someone like Harold Pemberton. The inspector's irritation turned at last into unease. Motive, once thought personal, was beginning to look financial, and that widened the field uncomfortably. Meanwhile, Edward Mallory was informed that his arrest would be delayed pending further inquiry. Though not freed from suspicion, he was no longer its sole focus. The village responded with confusion. Some resented the delay. Others grew anxious. Miss Marple sensed the tension tightening, the invisible pressure that preceded mistakes. And mistakes, she knew, were the enemy of concealment. Late one afternoon, she observed Mrs. Cartwright in animated conversation with Geraldine Fenton near the green. Their heads were close together. When Miss Marple approached, the conversation ended abruptly. Geraldine excused herself at once. Mrs. Cartwright lingered, smiling too brightly. "Such a strain on poor Geraldine," she said. "This business must be dreadful for her." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "especially when one wonders who might be next." The color drained from Mrs. Cartwright's face. "Next?" she repeated sharply. Miss Marple regarded her with gentle curiosity. If someone was silenced once to prevent discovery, it would be natural to fear further revelation. Mrs. Cartwright laughed, a thin sound. "I'm sure that's quite unnecessary." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "One hopes so." That night, a small disturbance occurred at Ashcroft House. Nothing dramatic. Merely a drawer found open in the study where Geraldine kept old village documents. Nothing was missing, but the intrusion was unmistakable. Inspector Dale viewed it as a nuisance. Miss Marple viewed it as panic. Someone had realized that Harold's notes might not have been destroyed with him. And fear, once awakened, rarely remained quiet. As Brackenmere settled uneasily into darkness, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily. The pattern was nearly complete now, the stitches forming a coherent whole. So too, she felt, was the truth. The murderer had acted not out of hatred nor jealousy, nor sudden impulse, but out of preservation, to protect comfort, reputation, control. And those motives, she reflected sadly, were among the most dangerous a human being could possess. The attempted intrusion at Ashcroft House unsettled the village far more than the murder itself had done. A death could be explained, compartmentalized, spoken of in hushed voices, but the idea that someone still moved quietly through familiar rooms at night disturbed something deeper. It suggested urgency, fear, the presence of a secret not yet fully buried. Inspector Dale treated it as a minor matter. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing documents, no clear suspect. He suspected curiosity, perhaps even nerves among the household staff. Yet he ordered the study, examined carefully, more to satisfy procedure than expectation. Miss Marple understood its meaning at once. Someone had panicked. The drawer that had been opened contained nothing particularly valuable, only old village correspondence, receipts, and committee records dating back several years. Papers few would bother to read unless they feared what they might contain. The following morning she visited Geraldine Fenton again. The older woman appeared strained, though she made an effort to maintain composure. "I feel quite violated," Geraldine said. "To think someone would search my house." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is rarely the searching that troubles us most, but what it implies." Geraldine hesitated. "You think they were looking for something specific?" "I do," Miss Marple said. "And I think they were disappointed." Geraldine's lips tightened. "They won't find anything here," she said firmly. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Instead, she asked softly, did Harold ever mention finding something that surprised him? Geraldine looked away. He said certain accounts did not align." "And did he name anyone?" "No." Miss Marple nodded. That omission, she thought, had cost him his life. Later that day, Inspector Dale received word that one of the village past fundraising accounts had indeed been altered years earlier, not dramatically, only enough to redirect small sums repeatedly. The amounts, accumulated over time, were considerable. When he announced this discovery, reactions were swift. Mrs. Cartwright grew indignant, insisting that such accusations were insulting. Clara Hewitt burst into tears, convinced she would be blamed regardless of truth. Several others protested loudly that Harold had always been too suspicious for his own good. Miss Marple noticed how quickly Mrs. Cartwright positioned herself at the center of these discussions, guiding them, shaping them, soothing concerns while subtly redirecting blame outward. Leadership, Miss Marple reflected, often concealed the strongest desire for control. The inspector began questioning Mrs. Cartwright more formally. She answered readily, even cheerfully, producing records, explanations, and plausible justification. Her confidence was impressive, perhaps too impressive. Miss Marple visited her once more, this time unannounced. Mrs. Cartwright welcomed her with visible surprise. The sitting room smelled faintly of polish, sharper than usual, as though recently scrubbed. "You're quite the visitor these days," Mrs. Cartwright said lightly. "Old habits," Miss Marple replied. "I find people fascinating." Mrs. Cartwright laughed. "You always were observant." Miss Marple glanced at the sideboard. A familiar teacup rested there, part of the same set used at Ashcroft House during the Reading Society. "Such a pretty pattern," Miss Marple remarked. "I believe Geraldine owns the full set." "Yes," Mrs. Cartwright said. "She lent me a few when one broke." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Cartwright stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Harold admired order," Miss Marple continued. He believed irregularities should be corrected. He had no compassion, Mrs. Cartwright snapped before she could stop herself. No understanding of circumstance. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. He was preparing to expose something, wasn't he? Mrs. Cartwright rose abruptly. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" Miss Marple asked gently. "He arranged to meet you privately in the library. You believed you could reassure him." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Cartwright's face had gone very pale. "He didn't deserve," she began, then stopped. Miss Marple did not accuse her. She merely waited. "He said he would report it," Mrs. Cartwright whispered at last. "That it was his duty, and you were afraid," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Cartwright's composure collapsed entirely then. "I only meant to frighten him," she said desperately. "The tea, I thought a little would make him ill. Enough to delay him." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but the dosage was misjudged. Tears spilled freely now. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Later that afternoon, Inspector Dale was summoned. Faced with evidence and her own unraveling narrative, Mrs. Cartwright confessed fully. She had diverted funds gradually, justifying each instance as temporary. When Harold uncovered the pattern, she panicked. She arranged to meet him behind the shelves, choosing the library because it offered privacy without suspicion. The teacup had been placed carefully, meant to seem ordinary. What she had intended as a delay became a death. The village received the truth with stunned disbelief. Edward Mallory was cleared quietly. Clara Hewitt wept with relief. Geraldine Fenton retreated once more, shaken but vindicated. Brackenmere-on-Wold returned, slowly, to its familiar routines, though something essential had shifted. The village would never again assume that politeness guaranteed safety. Miss Marple resumed her knitting by the window, watching life reassemble itself piece by piece. Human nature, she reflected, rarely revealed itself in moments of great drama. It showed itself instead in small decisions, in fear, in convenience, in the belief that one deserved to escape consequence. And those beliefs, she knew, were far more dangerous than any poison. The confession settled over Brackenmere-on-Wold with a strange, lingering heaviness. It did not arrive with drama or raised voices, but with quiet disbelief that seeped into every corner of the village. People spoke of it softly at first, as though raising their voices might make it more real. Mrs. Cartwright, bustling, helpful, endlessly present, had been the one who carried the poison into the library. The notion seemed incompatible with the woman they thought they knew. Inspector Dale handled the aftermath with efficiency. Statements were taken, timelines clarified, and the matter reduced to facts that could be written down and filed away. Yet, even as order returned in an official sense, something in the village resisted repair. The familiar comfort of shared assumptions had been shaken beyond easy mending. Miss Marple observed the changes with quiet attentiveness. Neighbors greeted one another politely, but with caution newly woven into their smiles. Tea invitations became rarer, and when they did occur, cups were exchanged with exaggerated transparency. Doors that once stood open in warm weather were now kept discreetly closed. Fear, Miss Marple knew, was not always loud. Often it simply taught people to watch. Edward Mallory prepared to leave Brackenmere not long after his name was cleared. The village's suspicions, though officially withdrawn, lingered uncomfortably around him. One afternoon he called upon Miss Marple to say goodbye. "I don't think I belong here anymore," he said simply. She nodded. Belonging is a fragile thing. Once broken, it rarely mends in the same shape. He hesitated. "You never believed it was me, did you?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "You had no reason to kill Harold Pemberton. You had learned, I think, to live with disappointment." Mallory exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight he had carried for weeks. He thanked her quietly and left before sentiment could overtake him. Clara Hewitt returned to her classroom with renewed diligence. Children sensed the change in her, a seriousness edged now with resolve. She no longer sought approval quite so anxiously. Whatever Harold Pemberton had threatened her with had lost its power in the face of truth. Geraldine Fenton resumed her social duties with measured restraint. Ashcroft House reopened for small gatherings, though the Reading Society was quietly dissolved. The library remained, immaculate and dignified, but few lingered there now. The space seemed altered, not haunted exactly, but aware. Miss Marple visited it once more at Geraldine's invitation. They sat together as afternoon light filtered across the shelves. "I keep thinking," Geraldine said slowly, "that I should have noticed." Miss Marple's voice was kind. "We notice what confirms what we already believe." Mrs. Cartwright was helpful, dependable. Those qualities often blind us. Geraldine sighed. Harold was trying to do the right thing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and that made him dangerous. The remark lingered between them. When Mrs. Cartwright was taken away, there was no spectacle, no crowd gathered. The village watched from behind lace curtains as the police car departed, carrying with it not only the murderer, but a comforting illusion. That departure marked a subtle ending, not just of a case, but of innocence. Life continued, as it always must. Markets reopened, church bells rang. Children laughed in the lanes, yet beneath the rhythms lay an awareness that evil did not always arrive from outside. Sometimes it brewed quietly at kitchen tables, hidden beneath good intentions, pleasant smiles. Miss Marple returned to her garden, tending roses and clipping hedges with steady patience. Visitors came less frequently now, and she welcomed the solitude. Reflection, she found, required quiet. One afternoon, as she knitted by the window, she thought again of Harold Pemberton. A difficult man, yes, but not an unimportant one. His insistence on order had uncovered disorder that others preferred not to see. In that sense, he had not died entirely in vain. Still, Miss Marple felt no triumph. Murder solved rarely brought satisfaction, only understanding. Human beings, she reflected, were endlessly capable of justifying small wrongs until those wrongs demanded defense, and when exposed, they often chose desperation over humility. That pattern, she knew, would repeat itself endlessly. In villages and cities, wherever people lived close enough to envy and fear. As dusk settled over Brackenmere-on-Wold, the hedgerows glowed softly in the fading light. The village appeared peaceful once more, but Miss Marple understood that peace was not the absence of danger, merely its concealment. She folded her knitting carefully and placed it in her basket. Tomorrow the roses would need pruning again. And somewhere, someday, human nature would present her with another puzzle, as it always did. In the weeks that followed, Brackenmere-on-Wold settled into a new version of itself, one shaped subtly by what it now knew about its own fragility. The village resumed its habits with careful deliberation, as though each familiar action required quiet confirmation before it could be trusted again. Life continued, but it did so thoughtfully, as if mindful that order once disturbed could not simply be assumed. Miss Marple noticed the change most clearly in the small things. The postman lingered less at the gate. The baker spoke more cautiously, choosing neutral topics. Even the weather, once a reliable source of communal complaint, seemed to invite restraint. Conversations rarely strayed beyond safe subjects. Opinions were offered with disclaimers. Judgment softened before being voiced. Trust, once given freely, had become conditional. Geraldine Fenton invited Miss Marple for tea one afternoon, not out of obligation but companionship. They sat in the sunlit drawing room, windows open to the soft sounds of the garden. "I find myself reconsidering everything," Geraldine admitted. "Who I relied upon, what I assumed." Miss Marple nodded. "Assumptions are useful for daily life," she said, "but dangerous when left unexamined." Geraldine smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost philosophical." "Age encourages reflection," Miss Marple replied gently. News from outside the village filtered in slowly. Mrs. Cartwright's case proceeded with little fanfare. She pleaded guilty, her explanation reduced to paragraphs of legal language that stripped away fear and remorse alike. The village read about it in the local paper with restrained curiosity. No one commented aloud for several days. When they finally did, it was with a peculiar detachment, as though speaking too passionately might invite another disruption. Edward Mallory wrote once, a short note thanking Miss Marple again before leaving the region entirely. Clara Hewitt threw herself into her teaching, channeling anxiety into discipline. Geraldine Fenton donated several volumes from the library to the county collection, saying the room felt too full of memory. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her routines. She walked her usual paths, visited her familiar shops, and tended her garden with renewed attention. The roses, recovering from an early frost, required patience. She found the work comforting. Growth, like truth, responded best to steady care. Occasionally, someone would approach her with curiosity barely concealed. "You saw it all, didn't you?" they would say. Miss Marple always smiled. "I merely listened." Listening, she reflected, was an undervalued skill. One afternoon, as she rested on a bench near the green, she overheard two women speak in hushed tones about the danger of being too involved in community affairs. "I'll never volunteer again," one said firmly. "It's not worth the trouble." Miss Marple sighed inwardly. Withdrawal was another form of fear, quieter but no less destructive. That evening she sat by her fire and considered the strange symmetry of it all. Harold Pemberton, rigid and officious, had uncovered dishonesty not through kindness but persistence. Mrs. Cartwright, warm and generous in appearance, had hidden wrongdoing behind charm and service. Appearances, once again, had proven unreliable. The world preferred its villains obvious and its heroes agreeable. Reality offered neither so conveniently. Miss Marple thought of how gently the crime had unfolded. A polite invitation, a warm cup of tea, a private conversation. Violence, when dressed in civility, often went unrecognized until it was too late. Yet she also thought of how truth had emerged not through force but through attention, through noticing discomfort where comfort should have been, through observing relief where grief belonged. Those signs, she knew, were universal. As autumn approached, Brackenmere prepared for harvest festivities with muted enthusiasm. Decorations were simpler this year, speeches shorter. The village sought warmth without spectacle. Miss Marple attended briefly, content to observe from the edge. Children laughed freely, untouched by memory. That, she reflected, was as it should be. Toward evening, as lanterns were lit and the air cooled, Geraldine Fenton joined her. "I sometimes wish I'd never hosted that gathering," Geraldine said softly. Miss Marple considered this. "And yet, had you not, the truth might have remained buried." Geraldine nodded slowly. "Truth," Miss Marple added, "is rarely kind in its arrival. But it is kinder than the lie that precedes it." When Miss Marple returned home that night, she placed her knitting aside and opened her Bible, reading not for instruction but comfort. The words felt familiar, grounding. She knew there would be other villages, other quiet lives disrupted by ordinary fears grown dangerous. She would not seek them out, nor wish for them, but she would be ready. Because human nature, for all its faults, followed patterns. And patterns once understood could be recognized again. Outside, Brackenmere lay peaceful beneath the stars, appearing once more like the village it had always pretended to be. Miss Marple knew better, and yet she loved it all the same. The evening air had turned crisp, as the village of Brackenmere settled into its familiar routine, with few lingering doubts about what had occurred in the days since Harold Pemberton's death. Though the story had faded somewhat from the village's daily conversations, it remained in the background, tucked away in the minds of those who had lived through it. There were whispers still, not of the crime itself, but of its consequences. People spoke less often of the murder, but more of Mrs. Cartwright's fall from grace. The weight of it seemed to hang over the village like the last traces of a storm. The harvest celebration had passed quietly, with little of the joy it once promised. Miss Marple had observed it all from the benches near the green where she had sat unnoticed, knitting as the villagers milled around her. It had been an understated affair, the village's attempt at reclaiming normality, but the unease never fully left the air. Yet through it all, she continued her routine. Gentle walks through the lanes, brief chats with the grocer, and the occasional tea with Mrs. Cartwright, whose posture had grown slightly more hunched since the arrest. That evening, as dusk wrapped the village in a quiet embrace, Geraldine Fenton called on Miss Marple, her presence at the door unexpected but not unwelcome. She entered the sitting room with a measure of hesitance, her gaze flicking about the room as though something had changed since their last meeting. "You've come to see how I am?" Miss Marple asked gently, sensing the weight of her visitor's thoughts. Geraldine took a seat by the fire. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "I suppose I've come to speak of everything," she said slowly, her voice steady but strained. "I think I owe you an apology, Miss Marple." Miss Marple watched her quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the words to find their shape. "I didn't tell you everything before," Geraldine continued, her voice faltering for the briefest moment. "Not about Harold, not about the accounts, not about Mrs. Cartwright." She swallowed hard. "I think I must have known, but I didn't want to see it. Not really." Miss Marple said nothing, simply allowing the silence to draw out her visitor's confession. The fire crackled, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls, as though time itself was holding its breath. "Harold was investigating the finances long before he was killed," Geraldine said, her eyes unfocused as she recalled the events of those last days. "He'd found something. I don't know what exactly, but I know now he must have come close to uncovering everything. The money Mrs. Cartwright had been moving around for years, the way she'd quietly manipulated the village accounts, always small amounts, always disguised as something else. She was clever, too clever." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression calm. "And you?" Geraldine glanced up sharply, meeting Miss Marple's gaze for the first time since she entered the room. There was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, but not guilt. "I was too afraid," she whispered, "afraid of the scandal, of losing everything. Mrs. Cartwright, she was my friend. I thought I could trust her. I thought for a while she would stop. But she never did. She kept taking just a little bit more, until it seemed like the whole house of cards was bound to fall." Geraldine's hands twisted in her lap. "And then Harold found it. He must have been investigating for weeks. But I didn't know how far he had gone until he came to me that morning." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And what did he say to you?" Geraldine's lips pressed together as she considered the memory. "He said he knew that he had proof, and that I could stop it all by helping him expose Mrs. Cartwright. But I was terrified. I knew that if Harold went through with it, everything would unravel. Everything. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose Ashcroft House, and I couldn't bear the shame." She shook her head slowly, as though the truth was too heavy to carry. "So, I did nothing." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but firm. "You knew it was wrong," she said softly. "I knew," Geraldine answered, her voice barely a whisper, "but I allowed it. I helped cover it up. I thought if I just waited long enough, Harold would drop it. But when he didn't, I was afraid he'd go to the authorities. I thought, in my desperation, that I might still be able to stop him." She paused, her face paling. "That's when I asked Mrs. Cartwright for help." Miss Marple let the silence stretch between them, her gaze never wavering. Geraldine's confession hung in the air like an unspoken question, waiting for its final resolution. "Mrs. Cartwright took it further, didn't she?" Miss Marple finally said, her voice low and certain. Geraldine nodded. "She didn't want him to talk. She couldn't afford to have Harold expose her, so she went to the library that morning. She took the poison with her. She thought it would be enough to make him ill, to delay his confession. But she misjudged the dose, and before she could stop him, Harold drank it. It wasn't supposed to kill him, but it did," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes," Geraldine whispered, "and I knew then that it was too late. I couldn't undo what had happened, and I didn't know what to do." She looked up, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of guilt and sorrow. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, but I might as well have. I let it happen. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her voice soft. You've carried this burden long enough, Geraldine. It's time to let the truth stand. The room was still, save for the soft crackle of the fire, as Geraldine absorbed the weight of her own words. The guilt that had gripped her for so long was now laid bare, its hold slowly loosening as the final pieces of the puzzle slid into place. For a long while, neither spoke. But in that silence, the last of the secrets that had shadowed Brackenmere were laid to rest, their weight finally acknowledged. Geraldine sat back in her chair, exhausted but lighter, as though the storm of years had finally passed. Miss Marple rose to her feet and moved toward the door, her movement slow but sure. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Geraldine said softly, her voice raw but filled with a quiet relief. Miss Marple gave her a final glance, her expression calm. "The truth always has a way of finding its place, Geraldine, even if it takes longer than we'd like." With that, Miss Marple stepped out into the quiet of the evening, her figure blending with the shadows. The village of Brackenmere-on-Wold would return to its peaceful rhythm, though it would never quite be the same. But for those who had lived through the shadows of lies and secrets, the truth had been revealed, and for once it was enough.